Welcome to Charity Village Connects. Between the pandemic and shifting demographics that include an aging population, a perfect storm threatens the very foundation of Canada's nonprofit sector. Upwards of 65% of Canadian nonprofits are now facing a severe volunteer shortage. This lack of volunteers has led to the cancellation and suspension of critical programming, and in some cases, the closure of an entire organizations. Considering that 58% of Canadian nonprofits are entirely volunteer run, it's clear that the sector cannot afford to ignore this issue. In this episode of Charity Village Connects, we examine the most recent trends impacting volunteerism in Canada and how organizations are trying to meet this challenge. Joining me to discuss these important issues is Lisa Mort Putland, the Executive Director at Volunteer Victoria. Lisa is a certified volunteer administrator who's worked in the volunteer-led sector for more than 2 decades and sits as the board chair for Volunteer Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Thank you, Mary. So delighted to be here.
Well, let's start by checking in on the current state of volunteerism in Canada. We're hearing rather alarming reports about a volunteer shortage, leading to some organizations even closing down. Can you give us a sense of what you're seeing in your community right now?
Well, Mary, I think there's a couple of things to think about. We are definitely seeing a shift in how organizations recruit volunteers and the responses that they get. But I would also argue that that shift is not as a result of the pandemic. It has been exacerbated by that. And there are some demographic groups that have changed significantly because of the pandemic. But we're also seeing opportunities that didn't exist previously. And so the message is a little bit convoluted. It is that volunteers have not gone away, but volunteering and connecting to volunteers has become more complicated. And also some of the infrastructure that used to support very passive volunteer recruitment has shifted. So a great example of that are school counselors and teachers that used to be very involved in helping young people think about volunteering. And during the pandemic, they rightfully so transferred their energies to building new curriculums and online classes. And so the connections that existed between schools and communities have frayed just a little bit. And so there isn't that automatic pipeline of students entering the volunteering market. It doesn't mean that it's gone away, but it means that it's definitely a little bit bruised and battered.
Lisa, you mentioned that that COVID-19 did have an influence. It wasn't the cause, but it certainly had an influence on a shift that's going on in volunteerism. Could you perhaps sort of dig into that a little bit deeper for us?
Certainly. So we know from statistical and demographic data that the number of older adults in volunteerism would reduce. So from about 2018, the sector has been saying there will be fewer older volunteers engaged in volunteerism, informal volunteerism. They will still be very much engaged in community building and in neighborhood work, but they won't necessarily be as connected to the formal things that they once did. And the pandemic exacerbated that shift. So instead of having a decade of change, we experienced a decade of change in 3.5 years, where people said, I still want to volunteer, but I'm not going to volunteer with as many organizations. I'm going to make choices about where I volunteer, and they're going to be very informed based on my needs rather than as a legacy of connection to an organization. And we've seen that in all types of groups, whether they be teeny tiny organizations or very large structured organizations. Volunteers have said, I'm quite happy doing something else. And my loyalty to your organization has shifted, And I'm not coming back the way that I once did.
Hmm. And it's my understanding that historically, that really the older demographic has been really the foundation for volunteerism in Canada, if that's correct. And so this accelerated shift during the pandemic really must have put a dent into things in terms of reducing the numbers that were available and very quickly.
So this again is really fascinating for those of us that are in the business every day. The number one demographic of volunteers are youth. More youth volunteer than any other group of age group, but they're able to give fewer hours. So older adults tend to give far more hours. And during the pandemic, that's what we saw, was people saying, well, I'm going to volunteer where my heart and my head are, but also where it's safest. I'm going to volunteer from home. I'm going to volunteer within my bubble, or I'm going to volunteer in spaces and places that are close to my neighborhood. I don't want to take the risk of taking a bus or meeting several hundred people in a day. And so once those parameters, once the shift was in play, as we know, it takes about 3 months to build a habit and about 3 months to lose a habit. So these are very normal life choices that people make. They just happen for everyone all at the same time.
Absolutely. It's totally understandable. Now, your organization, perhaps in response, launched the Senior Volunteering Project to explore the impact of COVID-19 on senior volunteers. What did you learn coming out of that research, and what should organizations be aware of as they attempt to bring back their senior volunteers?
Well, Mary, I think it's like all things. We have become more individualistic as a community. So there was a time when we used to send out a broad message, we need help. And everyone would say, I can do that. Now people are saying, I'm absolutely willing to help. I'm absolutely able to help. But helping has to be better than what I was doing during COVID. So, one of the quotes I like to use, because it really hit home for me, was a wonderful volunteer that said, volunteering has to be better than my book, right? I've learned to sit down and relax and read a great book and to connect with friends. So, volunteering has to be better than that. And for volunteer managers and for people in the volunteer led community who are rephrasing how they recruit volunteers, our best suggestion is to say, what is the recruitment journey? What does it feel like? And what does it look like? Is it too much trouble? Is it difficult to do? Do you still have an application form where the person has to print it off at home? Getting that many of us don't have printers anymore. So they're very simple things that are really barriers to volunteering. And so many organizations became experts at volunteer retention, but they weren't very good at volunteer recruitment. And so now we're saying this is an opportunity to really think through, how are you recruiting and supporting people from the minute they apply to the minute they decide to volunteer. And we have a great example from an organization that took down their volunteer application off their website and put up a very simple inquiry form. And the inquiry form garnished about 3 times the number of inquiries than the application form. And it's counterintuitive. Things have to be simpler, they have to be more immediate, they have to be available for people to do it on their phone or on a tablet. Um, and so that's why we say that yes, there is a shift. Yes, it's a little bit painful right now, but there are strategies that we can use to re engage people, and there are opportunities. And that's what this study really taught us, was that the principles of volunteering have not gone away, but the practices and how people connect, the exchange, the reciprocity is more important. So for people who have become used to just putting out a call for help and not thinking about what the volunteer needs, those are the organizations that I think have fallen into a pattern and they're struggling more.
Well, I really do want to get into the whole issue of recruitment and some new strategies that are perhaps called for more urgently now than ever before. But I want to talk a little bit more and dig a little bit deeper into the barriers to volunteering. I'm curious whether you're seeing barriers related to different ages, and how what is preventing them from giving back to their communities? Are you seeing unique challenges for different demographics? And are there ways that organizations can mitigate these barriers? We certainly saw during the pandemic, of course, you raised a really good point about how the older volunteers were more reluctant to go into a space that might put them at risk. And so that changed the way that they might consider volunteering. And if they were going to take a risk, they would do it for their most heartfelt volunteer work. But really, I'm curious whether there's other barriers now that we're through the pandemic that you're seeing continuing to affect the numbers of volunteers that are prepared to work with nonprofits and charities across Canada, and whether there's unique ones based on demographics or different types of volunteer roles, or what are those barriers?
So there are a few statistical things that we know. The number of international students registering at post-secondary and high schools in Canada dropped anywhere between 13 and 17%. That means that the feeder pool into volunteerism is much smaller than it was before the pandemic. So youth are astonishing volunteers, but there are fewer of them than there were perhaps before. The other challenge with youth that we're now beginning to recognize is geography. So the students that traveled to a destination school used to connect to volunteering through that school. Now many youth stayed home to study. So the opportunities to volunteer are in their hometowns, not in their school locations. But we know that most students learn about volunteering through leadership groups, and most organizations will recruit volunteers through schools. So that younger demographic needs some new connections, some new ways of learning about volunteering. And then there's the middle demographic, which are people who have been impacted by the cost of living, which means that they may be working more hours. And during the pandemic, we saw lots of individuals who work in the gig economy volunteering for the first time. They had a taste of it, they loved it, they were super engaged, and then the economy switched again. And so time and the cost of volunteering, which we often take for granted, but again, if you're going to volunteer at an event and you have to take an afternoon off work, what is that cost? And for people who are genuinely in the space where volunteering is something that they cannot contemplate, because they are already engaged in community, helping with family, working. And so sometimes we have to think differently about how we describe volunteering and community building, that it doesn't have to be a formal commitment to something all the time. So there's opportunities in workplace, in corporate volunteering, in working connected to volunteering, in activities that are connected to our work. And then also helping people recognize that volunteering is also a strategy to help them. So not just giving back to community, which is what everybody wants to do, but that also we have to be okay with language that says volunteering is strategic. It's about building networks. It's about building workplace skills. It's about furthering our careers. And so, in a space where people say, I have a limited amount of time, we want people to think strategically. And then we also want people who are already involved in volunteerism but never think about it. They're already taking their kids to every activity they can think of and are helping without recognizing that it's volunteerism and community building, to think about how they use that activity strategically, and layer that well. And newcomers will often say, I want to be part of a community. And we all sort of say, well, start where you are, start in your neighborhood, start with your family, start with schools. That there are no bad reasons to volunteer, but there may be some that are more useful when time and money and resources are limited. And so we really want to help people. That's why it's always helpful, we think, to sit down with someone who can help you with advising, to think through your volunteering strategies. It isn't difficult to find a place to volunteer, but it's often difficult to find the right place for someone to volunteer at their stage of life and to meet their volunteering needs.
So you mentioned some of the barriers to actual recruitment, and part of recruitment, as we know, is messaging, is making the message compelling for somebody to actually apply for a volunteer role. And you've also mentioned some technological challenges, using old school methods in a world that's being dramatically changed by the pandemic, where we all had to work and live and communicate remotely. And that organizations have to, I'm gathering what you're saying is that think about how their processes for recruitment. You mentioned printing things off at home. People don't have printers. They use their phones. They don't always are on computers to be able to apply. And, this has always been a challenge for the nonprofit sector to stay current with technological innovation. What are you seeing in the sector? Are you seeing good signs about this, and that they are making these changes that are so critical? I mean, did the pandemic actually accelerate this technological innovation in the recruitment side?
Yes and no. Um, Again, because the sector is so broad and there are so many organizations, yes, we are definitely seeing organizations that are upgrading and updating their technology and being top of mind. We're seeing chatbots and different tools coming into play. But historically, the number one complaint from volunteers to a volunteer centre like Volunteer Victoria is, I applied to volunteer and no one got back to me. It has been consistent throughout my career. And so we often look at those lost opportunities. So can a chatbot, can the technology make somebody feel like they were seen and heard in the moment that they needed to be seen and heard? But good volunteer management practice, connections. People do not volunteer because they're looking for another app. People volunteer because they're looking for experiences and people in their lives. So we can use the technology very wisely, but we also need to remember that there's a human connection. And depending on the demographic, depending on how we use the tools, we can create phenomenal experiences that are helpful, that are welcoming, where we create belonging. And we can also build community for people through their volunteerism that is meaningful and heartfelt and resonates. And so I think we're in this space where we can have a new look at volunteering, and still meet more needs. So it's an exciting time.
And I'd like to hear from you, from your perspective and your considerable experience, about currently what are the best practices that you would recommend to nonprofits and charities to up their game in terms of volunteer recruitment?
Yeah. Well, it sounds very simple, Mary, but I always ask people to look at their own websites and to go back to the basics. Where would you find out about volunteering in your organization? And 9 times out of 10, people come back and say, well, it took me a while, but I found the volunteer section. And the time that it takes, it is almost like the advent of the internet back in the 1980s, where we said, how complicated is it? And we're back at that spot. If it is too many steps, if it is too difficult to understand, if the language is not welcoming, if it's filled with acronyms, if volunteers look like they're wanted but not needed. So again, there's an application form, but we don't really need you. We don't need you now. We don't need you in a week. We're not really looking for you, but we were collecting your information. All of those things are very practical ways that we turn people off from volunteering. So our best advice always is when a volunteer experiences something that is positive, listen to them. When there is an experience that is less positive, listen to them. When there is something that's happening every day that's quite routine, listen to them. Organizations need to talk to their volunteers and figure out what they're doing well, where are the gaps, and how do they fill them. I also like, ask someone that does not know your organization to apply to be a volunteer and then listen to their journey. Like I said, consistently, regardless of the gender, the age, or the interests of the volunteer, the number one complaint is, I applied and no one got back to me. So again, we've become reliant. It's one of the downsides of technology. We've become reliant on our emails to give an automatic response. And that automatic response looks very unloving, very uncaring. It looks like something that is not welcoming. And so we've become reliant on it in many ways. And so I think going back to those basics. Also, during the pandemic, about 13% of volunteer managers locally were laid off. So there is a shortage of expertise in volunteer management. And again, we tend to think, well, volunteering is for everyone. Surely volunteer management can't be a profession. And you say, actually it is. It's both science and art, and it's about building relationships. And so for organizations that are interested in building up their toolboxes, to take a look, go visit their local volunteer center, visit Volunteer Canada, visit the Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada website, and take a little look at what's available, what's ready, and then, sit down, have a cup of tea with people and talk about volunteering experiences and what we can learn, how we become better at it. And then don't be afraid to look at the challenges head on. We know that across Canada, we have built a safety network of organizations, emergency response, fire departments, food banks, shelters for people experiencing homelessness that have used systems that we've repeated for decades. And now the systems look like they're collapsing because people are not responding in the same way. So we're in this emergent point where the industry and the sector has to shift. And we're going to experiment, and we're going to do some things really well, and we're going to learn and grow and shift. But we have to be able to share our learnings. And I think that's one of the reasons why these podcasts are so important, Mary, that it's about giving access to information so people can be curious and learn and grow, and change the way that we are engaging with volunteers safely and kindly, and putting volunteers back at the heart of the systems.
Well, I find it interesting that the role is called volunteer management because again, it's not just about recruiting, it's about managing them and retaining them. So I'd like to talk to you about best practices related to engagement, retention, and recognition of the work that they do.
Yeah. Again, Mary, I think it's such a it's a fascinating topic. We know from practice that not everyone engages the same way, and not everyone likes to be recognized the same way. Coming out of the pandemic, we know that volunteers made an intentional choice when they stayed in volunteerism, but they also experimented more. So we're seeing more people volunteering online and virtually. Those reciprocity exchanges are much harder. It's much harder to sit across a Zoom room and look someone in the eye and say, I really see you. Thank you for being here. It doesn't have the same type of impact. So, in some ways, we have to go back again to those basics around what do people need. We have to, first of all, ask them, how do they want to be recognized? How do we create reciprocity? How do we talk about it without being a bit vulgar? Because again, different generations and different cultures have different ways of talking about volunteerism. So sometimes it's the person who's leading the volunteer management team that has to have a bit of a sit down and say, this is the way that I've done it, and this is the way that I prefer to do it, but it's not the way that my volunteers want it anymore. So again, looking at other organizations and other ways of building reciprocity, engagement is really about, again, those human contacts. How are we connecting with our volunteers? How are we asking them what's working? What can we do better? What can we shift? Recognizing that we can't do everything all at once and there are going to be 1,000 answers, but out of those 1,000 answers will be common ground. The other thing, Mary, I think that's really important is that we're seeing more people who have never volunteered. So youth who would have perhaps volunteered during high school are now entering post-secondary or their first jobs without a lot of volunteering experience. So this is the first time in decades that we have a little ripple in our practice. So again, we have to go back and say, what does a great volunteering experience look like? What does it feel like? And most importantly, what does welcome and belonging feel like for our volunteers? Welcome, belonging, and learning are some of the most important things in reciprocity. So when a volunteer says, I want to know the difference that I made, not the difference that an organization made, but what did I do that made a difference? It's about paying attention to them. It's about engaging with them. It's about asking questions and noticing. And those are really skills that an amazing volunteer manager does very seamlessly. You sort of don't notice that they're doing it, but they're paying attention and they're listening. And so again, and I think like everyone else during the pandemic, everybody sort of craved more human connection. And so volunteering is this lovely way of bringing people together. But it's all part of, like you say, it's part of engagement, it's part of recognition, it's part of learning and growing. And also people of all ages and stages of life are experimenting with volunteerism differently. They're all in the place where what they once did has shifted and now they're learning something new. So it's this lovely space of opportunity.
Well, we certainly do know that Gen Z, I mean, we've seen many, many surveys about this, including ones that we've actually conducted ourselves at Charity Village and at our sister company, Talentake, that Gen Z likes to see immediate impact. They like to see the difference they make, and they like to see it quickly. That involves both, their work as donors as much as it does in their volunteer work. I'm sure that you're aware of this. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we were discussing this as a team the other day, where we said, there are times when we want to say thank you. We're like, we're gonna go away and think about it. We're gonna put a little video together, and in 3 or 4 weeks, we're gonna send it out. Not an unreasonable amount of time, but when everything in the world has become so instant, but also instant, but not, there's no connection to it. It's meaningless. So again, how do we say thank you in various different ways to every population, but particularly those that are time sensitive? And how do we look at that and say, this was meaningful? Again, it's about how we structure volunteering experiences so that, instead of having a group of volunteers without a volunteer team lead, you're saying, instead of leaving them, to do tasks, focus on the tasks, how about we focus on that reciprocity moment in that time? How do we build in thank yous in every meeting? How do we build in feedback in every meeting? And not, meetings as in board meetings, which we've learned a lot from, but how do we create those moments of community building in every point of contact? And again, it's science and art and trial and error. And like you say, Mary, there are some demographics that need more connection and contact. We're seeing youth who came through the pandemic, who recognizing that youth were the last demographic of people to be vaccinated. So they lived in that space of uncertainty much longer than many of us who are a little bit older. But they also had many rules. Don't meet outside of your cohort. Don't go to extracurricular activities. And now all of a sudden we want them to turn around and all of a sudden be very open about experimenting. And what we're learning is that their experiences were very different than ours. We had memory making of before the pandemic. We had decades of going out into groups of people and talking to strangers. They didn't. And so I think there will be a ripple that we have to accept and acknowledge. And then we have to be kinder and more welcoming and create new opportunities. Recently, I had a fantastic discussion with a young person who was volunteering at a senior center during the pandemic. And that cross-generational knowledge exchange was very powerful. And when we talked to this young person about, speaking to strangers, and she's like, oh, no. The ladies at the senior centers taught me how to do it. There was such joy in that little moment of community building and caring, but it's a reminder that we have to teach people how to connect again. We have to go back to the basics, and creating welcome and belonging in a safe place to land and learn is really important for volunteer-led organizations now. And we sort of, again, tend to think, well, the website tells them everything. I don't need to do it. You're like, no, actually, we've gone back a little bit in terms of how do we create spaces for volunteers to really thrive and flourish. And I think those organizations that can create that space will do really well, because there's more people looking for opportunities to engage and make a difference.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit and ask you about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it relates to volunteerism. Are organizations successfully creating accessible and inclusive volunteer roles, or are we seeing similar challenges that we see in HR and on boards of directors? Like how are organizations responding to the need to have more, I guess, inclusive ways of recruiting, but also thinking about what the roles are, especially if they're a public serving um, organization that are you know doing work that's related to the Canadian community, which, as you know, has changed so dramatically. Um, can you talk about that for us?
We have seen both an increase in the interest of being more inclusive and more welcoming, and also confusion about how to do it well. So we are still seeing organizations that see inclusion and diversity and equity as a process rather than a change in how they think and behave. Um, and we're all on the learning journey. So this is not a judgment of where people have landed or where they are. So the first assumption that I think people make is that there is a group of volunteers who are members of the BIPOC community. They are Indigenous, Black, Brown, people of color, or people of diversity, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ plus, and that there are groups of individuals who are not volunteering, who are not actively engaged, and that we will create an opportunity for them. And the first thing is to remember that those communities are very involved in volunteerism. They just perhaps are not volunteering where we see them or experience them because we are not engaged with their communities in meaningful ways. So when we talk to organizations, first we talk about welcome and belonging and say, well, what does it look like to land in your organization? And they sort of say, well, we're very welcoming. We want people to come. But then we say, well, how have you taken the next steps? And so we look at recruitment strategies again. We start with a strategy of how people will be involved at all levels of the organization. But also, how did we leave our desks? So the best question I often have, which sounds very simple, is where are the local ethnic food markets, or where is the disability resource center in your community? If you don't know where it is, why would people know where your organization is? Right? So how have we reached out? And when we reach out, are we reaching out with reciprocity, or are we reaching out with a request? So I don't know if you've ever walked up to a stranger and said, I need you to do something for me. That's in reality what we're doing, right? Is we're saying, I need something from you to make me better. And the real answer, I think, after listening to many diversity specialists like Dr. Musa Magasa, is what does welcome look like? What are we offering people when they come to our organization that is of benefit for them, not for us? And then to really look at the dimensions of diversity and say, what are we going to focus on? We can't do everything, and we can't do everything all at once. And that's one of the challenges of board work. Is, boards, when we look at leadership and we say, well, let's make a change. You say, well, how are we going to do that? And so, Mary, we have seen organizations that are BIPOC led, they are LGBTQ plus led, they are Indigenous led, they're doing phenomenally well. They do not need us to help them. But in being good allies, what can we do to walk beside organizations to be helpful and supportive? How can we form together to build community that better understands each other? How can we engage in cross-pollination, cross-communication? And I think those are the places where organizations that are a little bit further ahead figured out, how do we, instead of asking something of someone, how do we ask, how do we do this together? So again, I think it's a very complicated space. It's not one size fits all or one answer. It's really about being part, and again, creating welcome and community, being willing to change. Because as we've learned when we talk about, and I think, Mary, one of our learnings comes from, many decades ago, there was a movement to include more youth in leadership roles. And the organizations that still held their board meetings during school time hours often learned that youth wouldn't attend. And it was it was about logistics. And so I don't mean to simplify what is a very complex issue, but some of the things that we do as organizations where we say, well, we'd like change, but we'd like change on our own terms. So where we've seen organizations really think about what does it mean to engage with a group. So again, one of the wonderful lessons we learned at Volunteer Victoria, when we listened to our community members from who are persons with disabilities, was that our meetings were held too early in the morning for people who have caregivers. And so a 9 o'clock meeting was virtually impossible for some of our leaders to attend. But when we moved it back a couple of hours, we created space for belonging and welcome and inclusion, moving meetings onto Zoom, so that we cut down the time that it takes. And then, someone said to me the other day, you have to book a handy dart 2 weeks in advance, right? When you call a meeting at the last minute, I'm not going to be able to attend, not because I don't want to, but because I'm unable to make those logistics work. So again, I think, Mary, it's there's space to do this well. There's space for learning and growth, but there's also lots more room for listening and hearing and adapting. And volunteers come to us from all spaces, as newcomers to Canada and newcomers to British Columbia. They come to us as persons who are able-bodied and who are persons who have medical challenges. Volunteer Victoria has a program for persons on a mental health or substance use journey that we've had for decades. And we've learned that quiet space is really important in an office. So sometimes they're really tiny shifts, and sometimes they're monumental. We would say, keep listening. When you're recruiting volunteers and you want to shift, is think about where those volunteers are and how easy it is for you to go to them, not for them to come to you. And if that's the top tip, is think about where people are and go to where they are, so that you can first build friendship, and then you can build a shared experience, and then you can talk about volunteerism and what it means to everyone, because there's shared reciprocity in it.
Well, I'd like to close, Lisa, with giving you an opportunity to do a little crystal ball gazing. And I'm just curious about, when you think about volunteering, where do you think it's headed, and what are your hopes for the future?
Oh, Mary, you've already learned that I can talk a lot, and I'm so excited about what happens. Canada goes through, shifts in volunteerism. Volunteering isn't new. It's hundreds of years old. And we're at this point of shift now where we see a space where there isn't a monolith of volunteering. There isn't one group of volunteers who leads the way. We're now seeing a democracy emerging in volunteerism where volunteers have more power to ask for what they need and what they want, and for organizations to shift their practices to be more responsive. And I think that's exciting. I also think that this is an opportunity for us to think about volunteerism not as an act of kindness, but as an act of strategy in communities. We're seeing climate change, we're seeing devastating floods and fires, that we recognize, and the pandemic taught us all the importance of community and how in our times of need, there is always a volunteer, whether that be someone formally trained and assessed and put into a community, or whether it be a neighbor who says, I see you, that has become more important, and that we've learned that there are tools and strategies that are needed to ensure that that kindness and that responsiveness continues in community. And I think there's opportunities for us to listen to each other and talk more, for us to build some policy and practice to think through what volunteerism looks like. And also, the message is that volunteering has shifted. There is a shortage of volunteering for some volunteer positions, but there isn't a shortage of people wanting to be kind and wanting to give back to community. They just want to do it differently. And so there's this space for listening and growing. Um, I'm excited about it because I get to meet volunteers every day. And the one universal truth, Mary, is that they all want to do something good. They've all stepped forward. Um, we don't get people coming into a volunteer center that say, I don't want to do it. I didn't want to be here. Um, there is goodness and kindness, and there's lots of opportunities ahead if we just create the safe space for landing.
Well, Lisa, that is a wonderful way to wrap up our discussion. Thank you for your keen and thoughtful insight and perspectives on volunteerism in Canada. It's so appreciated, and it will be appreciated for the nonprofit organizations as their leaders seek solutions to these difficult challenges. And your inspiring comments have really inspired me to think differently about how I engage with the volunteer work that I do as well. So thank you for joining us at Charity Village Connects, Lisa.
Thank you, Mary. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.